Hi, this is my response to the critical thinking readings and the video on how to write well. And I'm going to start with one of my big complaints about both of these, which is they're a bit dated. They're not, the concepts are holding up as well as they can, but all the specifics aren't. And I'm going to start by talking about Richard Paul's video on how to write well, something I feel fairly comfortable critiquing because I've taught writing for 20 years at this point and at a college level. And almost everything he talks about I can find in any single college composition textbook. And yet there's more to it than just teaching the thinking aspect. There's the communication side of it, and he doesn't really address that in the terms of language. In the 20 years I've taught, I've seen my students' abilities to use technology go up. Their ability to use language, which is the major tool of communication, however, has become a problem. And that's, you'll hear most people say that who've been teaching, in part because of changes in K-12, in part because of changes in English pedagogy, but certainly composition pedagogy includes critical thinking. I was taught most of what Paul says as an approach to how to teach writing, to have evidence, to have the 5-paragraph essay. Current pedagogy views the 5-paragraph essay as that limitation where he says, the student says, this tamps my creativity. And he says, prove it. Well, studies prove it. There's a lot of pedagogy out there that talks about how the 5-paragraph essay is a great starting point, but ultimately limits students' thoughts in writing to that pattern and going no broader. Which, when you try to write a dissertation or try to write a master's thesis, a traditional master's thesis, try to write anything, you need more than 3 pieces of evidence for your points. A lot of it is also jargon, like he talks about how you need to have a point of view. Well, that's a thesis statement. He talks about evidence and reasons. Well, those aren't totally different things. He talks about you have to have conclusions and consequences and implications. He talks about the things we take for granted, which in English we call assumptions. And you have to examine every single one of those. You have to examine yours. You have to examine your audiences. This is what we teach them to do to be good writers. But you can only teach someone to do something. You cannot force it on them. And that part of the equation is missing. And you can teach them and you can show them. But just look around and you can, and like I said, 20 years, everybody I know who I learned how to teach comp with learned the same stuff. It's got to be foundational. College is too late. And I don't know if the way Paul teaches critical theory will work quite as well with younger kids. But it is, English pedagogy has moved on a lot since 1981. Which is actually when I was in college the first time. Well, 1983. And composition has changed a lot since my first composition class. For the better, so that peer review is built in. I don't know a single teacher who doesn't say, exchange your paper, have an audience member read it, have someone read it and give you feedback. We still read every single one of our students' papers, so Paul can take that idea out. That's not how you teach. You have to be involved in what they write because they need more than just models. I was given models. Models don't help. Models need explanation and examination, and students can't do that on their own. You have to model it in your behavior, and you have to teach it and illustrate it and explain it and do all the things he says a good writer does. You have to do as a teacher. This is also true with the readings. I don't know if I had a very weird education or not, but I was, and possibly it has to do with having been taught English when I was taught English. But this idea of becoming a fair-minded thinker is built into how we teach English. and how I was taught to teach English, which is to take a point and examine both sides. You look at both sides. If it's a topic people cannot look at both sides of, then that's not an appropriate topic to write on at that point. Maybe at another time. But we were taught to be fair-minded. I was taught all of these virtues of a disciplined mind. I was taught to think for myself, autonomy. I was taught to have integrity and to be honest and to cite my sources, which at this point, I have to agree with Sandra, annoys me that they don't. I was taught to be aware I didn't know everything. I was taught to have a sense of justice. I was taught to persevere, which only works at some levels. I was taught to be fair-minded and confident and have courageousness, or have courage, excuse me. Sometimes I read too much of my students' writing. I was taught to have empathy. I was taught the other side was wrong. So, I don't know, maybe all my teachers bred Paul and disseminated him to the world. I don't know. Perhaps what Paul was saying was in the air at the time. I do not know. But I've been exposed to most of this and have most of this told to me. And I do say, the one quote that came to my mind, and the one note I wrote really big in the book, and I am an annotator of my books, is, I know nothing except the fact of my ignorance, Socrates' favorite quote. And I have been taught by my teachers that that is the starting point for anything. To know that you don't, no matter what you think you don't know anything. You start with that. You start as that blank slate. You do your research, or you do your thinking. You look at both sides of the matter. After you've weighed your evidence, then you come up with your conclusions. Then you move forward to actually writing. So I was taught that process. That's how I was taught. So becoming a fair-minded thinker wasn't much of anything. I mean, to me, that's academic, what you're supposed to learn how to do. And it's what you're supposed to be. So as I read that, what I did was when I read that, I was very amused how sadly we fail in 2019 to live up to this as a society. Almost as a whole, thanks to social media, we follow the side of the undisciplined thinker. And we shouldn't blame social media totally. It's a whole bunch of stuff. So when I read chapter 8, I was like, design your life. Great. And I was impressed by the existential bent of the chapter, but my two fields are English and philosophy, so critical thinking is second nature to me. So reading this again, I was like, yeah, so. Sartre says this, so-and-so says this. They're synthesizing stuff, and that's not a bad skill, but it was, nothing I hadn't run across before. And like I say, maybe I've just been lucky. Then again, I took critical thinking at the end of last year, the beginning of this year. I'd have to actually check my calendar. Well, okay, of 2018, I should say. And, we were made to look at both sides of every issue before we came up with a point. It's built into the paper I had to write. The simulation issue, I had to look at this side and the opposite side before I could make a conclusion. Maybe I'm just lucky. But as I read this chapter, I found my own critical thinking kicking in, and the whole thing we want meta experiences, and all this stuff started feeling like a little bit elitist. The attack on social forces in the mass media and our experience felt, again, forced. For someone who's written papers that deal with the reality versus subjectivity and relativism and all this, it just, I know it's for a non-academic audience, but it felt shallow. And then they gave us this list about reading backward. My major in college, my second one, was English literature. So, of course, I'm going to cheer for reading backwards. Yes, there's a great deal to be learned from the past. And then I looked at their list. And this is one of the problems that lives in philosophy. And I just mentioned it to my philosophy class the other day. it's still the bastion of dead white men, because this list that they give us of things to read backwards that they recommend or sample, all but 5 are dead white men, dead white European men, and that's one of the problems. And when I hit that, I was just immediately turned off. And I know I shouldn't be. I should be able to put aside my emotions for that, and probably I will be able to and go back. But just looking at the list, it was like, really? And I know and I know they might have been writing in 1981, but I went and checked, and I'll recheck. You know, this was published in 2014, this book we're looking at. They should have more than dead white men. I'm not saying the dead white men included are not great writers, but they are. And then the idea that you should design your own life, well, that's fine. That's what Sartre says to do. We make the choices. But we don't always make choices based on our critical thinking. And one of the things I'm seeing as something I'm going to end up critiquing these folks on is, if it's not someone who promoted rationalism, they didn't really bring him in, because when I looked at their list, and they have no David Hume, who is basically the founder or the promoter of skepticism and of critical thinking in the 1740s, and he's not in there. I start to get suspicious. So while I appreciate what Paul and Elder are doing, and while I see a lot of useful material that can be taken and applied to teaching, when I look back at their agenda, I'm wondering what it is that they think they're accomplishing. Foucault says those with power create the discourse. And of course, he's talking about more than just 1 or 2 people. But it is a question to answer and something to think about, because, like Hume, we've got to remember, reasons and passion, or reasons and emotions, do go together. And sometimes reasons and rationality and logic aren't going to overcome your passions. And right now, that's where I stand with this. No matter what they're saying, right now, they've got me in a place where my emotions are stronger, and I have to walk away for a while. And that's where I'm going to stop.